She's talking about the defining decade. She's talking about people who are struggling in their 20s in terms of different mental health issues because she's a psychologist, but she's not even talking about why is it that our culture or our society is making so many people in their 20s feel lost or feel like life is pointless. That to me is the more interesting question. If you need this book, you shouldn't read it, which is just like not how a book should be marketed or written at all. So this book was a bit of a mystery to me. It's so typical that as I sit down to film, the sun is coming out. We're going through the books that I read this year. Last year, I was able to read 63 books. I did not read that many this year. In January, I did no reading. I did a daily video challenge. I wasn't reading so much because I was focused on posting videos. In February, I read Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. I did reread this later in the year. It's a really great book if you haven't read it. I know there will be parts of it which are a lot sadder to read now, just in terms of like the things that he had hoped to do. In March, I read Why Has No One Told Me This Before by Dr. Julie. I really enjoyed reading. It was a nice summary of various different things that you can do to help your mental health. I don't think anything in there was brand new to me, but it's always helpful with mental health stuff to be reminded of the same things. Some of the stuff is really simple in terms of getting a good night's sleep, making sure you stay connected. It can seem really obvious, but those little things are sometimes the things that we can overlook the most. My dissertation was due at the end of March. That was my main focus. I was reading different journal articles. I have been doing reading, but it was academic reading. I would skim read like biographies of Dostoevsky or different chapters of different books related to the double or Crime and Punishment. By April, I had finished my dissertation and submitted it. That meant that I could get back into reading for fun alongside reading things for my degree. I reread Looking for Alaska by John Green. I've read this book so many times. First read it, I think, when I was 16. I can remember one of my friends talking about it in sixth form. I liked how it's quite bleak. My sister, I gave her the book that I had and I was like, oh, you have to read this. And she did not get on with it at all, I think, because she didn't like that bleak aspect to it. I enjoyed it and I enjoyed rereading it, I don't know, for like the fourth time. Look, it's so bright. So typical. This morning it was literally raining and I was like, oh, perfect day for filming. The next book I read in April was Becoming Supernatural by Joe Dispenza. It was so interesting. I really feel like I need to reread this book and make notes. I did take pictures of the pages as I was reading because that's what I tend to do, because then I can look back on the things that stuck out to me. I think I would benefit from reading this book again because it's a really interesting mix of spiritual concepts and then neurological concepts, and then it's even got quantum physics. There's some really interesting ideas in this book about healing and about using the power of your mind. He tells some miraculous stories in the book about people who've used different breathing techniques or meditation practices to heal back pain, heal chronic pain. It's interesting. I didn't so much engage with the spiritual side of it because I have my own version of that, like tied up with being in recovery from addiction. I read The Grown Up by Gillian Flynn. This is a short story and I read it for my degree. It was part of my creative writing module. Really enjoyed this. It is a short story, so it's not going to take you long to read, and it has a really interesting twist. It's really good. I recommend you read this, definitely. Oh my gosh, I read Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. This was for my degree. Do not read this. Do not read this. The notes that I made, because I've kept track of the books I've read on the notes app on my phone. OMG, waste of time, horrible characterization, and boring, all in capital letters. So yeah, don't read that. I then read Ride Through Palestine by Anthony Trollope. This was better than Cranford. It was again something I read for my degree. It was still not anything that I particularly enjoyed. The note I made was better than Cranford, but then that's a low bar. Another book that I read for my degree was The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I really enjoyed this, so this is one that I do recommend. I read this digitally because that was the copy that was available through my university library. I always find it weird reading digital books, you know, specifically books on my computer as opposed to a physical copy or even like a Kindle. It feels almost like work having to, sorry, the sun's coming out again, work reading on a computer. So if I hadn't read it on my computer, I would have enjoyed it even more. Even saying that, I really did enjoy this book. It's a detective story and a bit of a mystery, so if you like that kind of book, then you will probably enjoy this. Now we move on to May, and I read The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens. This was the last book that he wrote. He never actually finished it. I read what is available, but it's not a complete story. Honestly, I am not a massive fan of Charles Dickens. I like his characters, like Oliver Twist. I think that's an interesting story and interesting characters, but I did not enjoy reading it. You know, that's the kind of thing where I'm like, oh, I prefer the musical of this, or like the film. The story itself and the characters are compelling, but I just don't like the way he writes. I really didn't enjoy this, aside from the fact that it's not even a finished book. One that I do recommend, and I think this is in my top 10 books of the year, is She by H. Rider Haggard. The note that I made after I finished reading this was, OMG, phenomenal, all in capital letters, phenomenal journey setting. This is one of those books that you feel like you're transported into the world that the writer has created. You're not aware that you're reading. You don't keep thinking like, oh, how much have I read? Particularly because this was a book that I read for my degree. That was like an obligation. I wasn't necessarily choosing to read this book. I wouldn't necessarily enjoy it, but I had to read it, as we've seen with, you know, Cranford, which I really didn't enjoy. So the fact that this book not only was one that I really liked, but it also transported me into another world. Really recommend it. Really unique and not really like anything I'd read before. I was able to download it on my Kindle for free because it's out of copyright. You can download it for £0 for nothing, and it's a brilliant story. Really recommend that you do that. The next book I read was Inkheart by Cornelia Funke. I remember reading this when I was like 10. I absolutely loved it. In May, I was just feeling like I wanted to balance out some of the university reading I was doing with just something like light and fun and maybe a bit nostalgic. This is the thing with revisiting things that you really liked when you were younger. You can either grow more fond of it, or it can be a bit disappointing because you're like, oh, it's not as good as I remembered it. I guess because if I'm reading something when I'm 10, I'm just taken in by the story and the characters, whereas reading something now, I'm more looking at the way it's put together. It doesn't feel the same because it is about a young girl. So I think when I was 10, I could identify with her and I'd be like, oh, what would it be like if this was my life, or this was the world that I was living in, or this was what happened. But particularly there's a bit where they go to this like abandoned town. This is like the baddies town, and like no one from the surrounding area goes there. Like it just, I can see how that would have appealed to me when I was younger, and I would have been like, oh, cool. But now it didn't click in the same way. It didn't feel real. I read No Cure for Being Human by Kate Bowler. This was a recommendation from Julie, who watches some of my videos and leaves really thoughtful comments, and often leaves a book recommendation or two, which I really appreciate, and I've been making notes of. There are so many books that I want to read, and she specifically mentioned Kate Bowler. The one that she mentioned I couldn't find in the library, but I could find this one, No Cure for Being Human. I had no idea what to expect. The blurb looked interesting. It was a suggestion from someone who, you know, is giving good suggestions and thoughtful comments, so I was like, this will probably be in line with something that I would like. Let's just start with the note that I made immediately after I finished reading this book. Hated it at the start, but poignant by the end. And I think that is a good little summary of the journey that this book took me on. I also put, which maybe is a bit harsh, she's smug. I think definitely this was an example of carrying on reading something that really challenged me. And I think this can be a really good thing, because if you read something, or even like watching a video or a particular bit of news, reading a specific newspaper or magazine that you don't normally read and that the views you don't align with them, it can be a really useful exercise because it can help you define what you think or what you believe. It can help you articulate some things because you're then able to act in response to what you're reading. And it can also, in terms of like non-fiction like this, it can be helpful to read this kind of book and have that standoffish reaction, and that like, oh, I want to put this down, I don't want to read this anymore, to have that reaction because it can show something about you. And definitely I think the reason why I did not like this book at the beginning is because of things that I've been through. So she talks about how at 32 she's diagnosed with cancer. I think the problem for me was that she seemed to have this tone at the start when she's setting up, describing all of these things that have happened and describing her diagnosis. She seems to have this tone of, but I'm a good person, so I don't understand why this thing happened to me. This is a whole other topic that we can make a separate video on, and I'm really thinking of talking about this, because the idea that if you're good or if you do things right, then bad things don't happen to you, or, you know, the inverse of that, if something bad has happened to you, it means that you've done something to deserve it. We do this because it helps us feel in control and it helps us feel safe, because the idea that something bad could randomly happen to you, that's really scary. The idea that you could suddenly become homeless, that's really scary, when in reality, you just need a few things to go wrong at the same time, and that could very well end up being your situation. You're far more likely to end up homeless than you are to become a millionaire, but we don't like to think of it like that. And so I think this book and just her attitude in terms of the way she's describing what's happened to her, it provoked me and made me want to put the book down, just because I've had a family member who was younger than me who had cancer, and Kate Bowler saying, oh, but I'm 32, like I have my husband who I met in high school, like what, my high school sweetheart, and I have got my child, like how could this happen to me? And I'm like, do you think that bad things happen to people because they deserve it? What do you mean? How could this happen to me? Like, this is the world. And I think this is definitely a me thing, right? Like, we bring things to the books that we read and we read things into them, which is why this book made me uncomfortable at the beginning, because I was like, you had 32 years of this great life. Like she's saying, I married my high school sweetheart, all of this stuff. You got that? Like, some people don't even get that. I've experienced this with other people as well, where, I don't know, last year there was something that happened and then this person was going through grief, and she was a few years older than me, but she was acting like she'd never been through anything before, and it was really irritating to me. And I know this is my thing this is my thing to deal with. I just don't understand, I guess because it's not my lived experience, I don't understand people who wander their way through life with really nothing bad happening and having this naive belief that everything will be okay or everything will work out. Like, yes, I do believe that everything will be okay, everything will work out, but that doesn't mean that nothing bad is going to happen to you in the meantime. Like, the reason you have to have this belief of everything will work out is because you've been through so much bad stuff that you have to trust that you will be able to make it through the bad stuff. That's the way I see it, where it seems like a lot of people, they're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. I'm like, what kind of a sheltered life have you led? This is where, as well, I maybe sound like quite bitter. And again, that's my thing to deal with. This book was just a very interesting example of reading something that made me really uncomfortable. It's like people not even realizing what they have, or thinking that what they have isn't temporary. Like, everything is. You could lose anything at any point. There are no guarantees. And I guess maybe the reason I get so angry is because I wish I could live like that. Like, I wish I could be so shocked when things happen. If what happened to her were to happen to me, I would not, it would be awful. Like, I'm not trying to take away from her experience and what she went through, but like, I just don't have that view that I deserve to be happy, or I deserve to be safe or healthy. Like, that's not what I've seen happen to people around me. And also, in terms of recovery from addiction, that's not what I've been through either. I guess the reason I'm angry is because I envy their naivety, or envy the fact that they had so much time. She's saying, oh, this thing happened to me when I was 32. And I'm like, yeah, well, you had 16 more years than me in terms of working out that the world actually isn't fair. Like, you had a lot of time before you had to deal with something big like this. I did finish the book because I thought it was important to finish it. I'm not one of those people who, like, once I start a book, I have to finish it. But with this, I was like, the fact that it's difficult for me to read at the beginning, I should carry on with this because I might learn something, or at least my perspective might change by the end. I don't know whether that beginning part where she's saying, like, can't believe this bad stuff happened to me when I'm good, or when I have such a good life. I don't know if she's deliberately set that up, because later on she does then talk about pain making her narcissistic, and she talks to someone else who has cancer or is in treatment for something. They have this conversation about, I don't want my pain to make me narcissistic. If you're wondering what that looks like, rewind the last 5 minutes of this video where I'm going on about how the beginning of this book provoked me. You can get stuck in that, and I'm aware of that. You can end up, if you've been through something horrible, it can make you narcissistic, or it can make you insensitive to other people's pain, because you're like, well, what did you expect? Like, this is life. You can't just think everything's going to be good. I resonated with that bit, and it did seem that there was then some self-awareness, but I think that was also what bugged me, was in the beginning of the book, she just didn't seem to have any self-awareness about what she was writing. I was like, are you counting on the fact that most of your readers will not have experienced anything bad? Like, are you really counting on the fact that they haven't gone through grief or haven't experienced loss and are going to empathize with you? Because if anything, I not only did not empathize with her, but I was actively, like, set up against her just from the way it was written. Again, this is probably all a me thing, but this was just the way I read it. I am glad I read it though, and it is an interesting and thoughtful book, so I recommend you read it and see for yourself. In June, I read one book, and it was Friends, Lovers and the Big Terrible Thing, which I also read in February. I only read one book in June because I did a 33-day daily video challenge again, so I was posting a video every day through June. It was a lot of work, but it was also a really interesting creative adventure, getting really efficient at editing so that I could make a new video and produce a new video, edit a new video and get it out every day. In the midst of that, I did manage to reread this book because I wanted to do a video about it. I will link the video for you if you want to check that out. This book is sad, but I think it's a really important book. I would say if you don't really have any context or experience of addiction, this book will be very shocking because the stuff he describes is really intense. He had this disease really badly. As someone in recovery, as someone who has talked to a lot of other people in recovery, a lot of what he said, while it's awful, it was not shocking to me just because I've heard similar things. I've been through at least some of the same behaviors and thought some of the same things, so I related to it at some part. It's a really good book. Really recommend. In June, I also read Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. I did a whole video reviewing this book because I loved it so much. This also belongs in my top 10 books of the year. I don't know why it got missed out from the list on the notes app on my phone. Read this book. It is beautiful, interesting, insightful, and a really lovely autobiography. In July, I started reading a book that my sister recommended called A Court of Thorns and Roses, and you've either heard of it and are like, oh my gosh, or you've not heard of it and you're like, so what? This book is first of a series, and yes, I went on to read the whole series. In fact, I read the whole series twice. You will see now that we're into summer and I'm talking about the books from July onwards, you will see how the next few months I am very heavily reading fantasy, because at this point I had graduated and I had no idea what I was doing. So I found quite a lot of comfort in just escaping into a fantasy world where things are completely different from my reality. I really enjoyed this book and I enjoyed the series, and we will talk more about the series as I get onto those ones and we talk about them. I reread Run Baby Run by Nicky Cruz. I read this in a day. It is so good. Like, what an amazing story. He was a gangster in New York in the 1950s or 1960s. He meets a preacher called David Wilkerson. He's the leader of some gang, and he goes from that to being in school to be a preacher himself. Like, the transformation is immense. It's just such a powerful testimony and a really compelling story, so I do recommend that you read this one. Fall of Giants by Ken Follett is the first book in his Century trilogy. If you have read any Ken Follett books, you know that they are really long, like 1,000 pages long. I did enjoy this book once I got into it. Not that it takes effort, I don't want to say that, because it's really well worth it. But it's just, you know, when you open a book and it's got either a map or a list of characters and you're just like, do I have the energy to stick with this long enough to work out who all the characters are, to enjoy the book? Thankfully I did, and I stuck with it, and it's really good. Highly recommend. It has different families and different stories to follow, so you're not just following one character, but they're all kind of interlinked. It's sort of based in Wales, but then it's also based in France. It's sort of centered around World War One. If you like historical fiction, really recommend it. But also, if you like historical fiction, I'm guessing that you may have already read it. After that break away from the Court of Thorns and Roses series, I read the next book, Court of Mist and Fury. This was because I was waiting for it from the library. Otherwise, I would have wanted to read it straight away after I'd finished Court of Thorns and Roses. I have such a strong memory of reading this, and it was raining, and I read quite a lot of it all in one day. You know, when you suddenly get to a point with a book and everything clicks, you're like, okay, yes, I get the story, I get the world, I get the characters, I'm in this world now, I want to read. And you just read the whole thing. That's what happened. I finished reading it at 1 a.m. So many emotions. I literally felt sick reading the last 60 pages of this book because I was so enthralled and so apprehensive, and oh my gosh, it did not disappoint. And then I've written like a whole tirade about the various characters in the book, which I'm not going to read because I think you should read this series, so I don't want to give too much of it away. Beautifully done in capital letters. So you can see I enjoyed this book, and because I liked it so much, I then went straight on to the next one, A Court of Wings and Ruin. My sister had a copy of this, so I didn't have to wait for it from the library. I was straight on reading that, but I did slow it down because I was like, the other book was so good and I enjoyed it so much, but I read it so quickly. I read like the majority of it in a day. I was like, I want to savor this experience. You know, sometimes if you read a book really quickly like that, it can feel like a race to the end and you're not necessarily paying attention to little details that are actually pretty important to the story. Sometimes then you get to the end and you're like, oh wait, that bit, I can remember them talking about that earlier, but I sort of breezed past it. So I was like, I'm going to slow down and try and just read a little bit of this every day. That's what I did. So there was a week between finishing A Court of Mist and Fury and then finishing A Court of Wings and Ruin, which I liked. And the mini review I gave it was A Court of Wings and Ruin, relentless, action-packed, just one thing after another. Oh my gosh, the number of times I gasped out loud reacting to what was happening in the book. Just a wild ride. I then read the next one in the series, A Court of Frost and Starlight. This is not as long. The other ones are like 600 pages long. It's basically like a novella in comparison. I have got a copy of it. Let's see how many pages it is. It's 230 pages. So it's not really a novella, is it? But compared to the other books, which are like this, it's quite short. It's still a nice little story. It's wintry. It's about the winter solstice that they celebrate in this world. So it's a good book to read at this time of year in winter. The next book I read was Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. This book was so good and I took so many notes, like I took so many photos as I was reading it because there was just so much good information in there. If you're thinking of starting a YouTube channel or starting a business, I really recommend this book because it has some really thought-provoking advice and also actionable steps that can help you define what you want your channel to be, what you want your brand to be, how to center customers or viewers, whatever your brand is. I really recommend it. I might even buy myself a copy of this because I really did enjoy it. There's a lot of good stuff in this book. The Defining Decade by Meg Jay. I can't remember who recommended this to me. I've got a list on my computer of books that I see people talking about online, see quotes from online, and I think that looks interesting. I want to read that. And I really need to start putting who recommended it because I want to know who told me to read this book and why. This book really confused me. It's about how you need to do things in your 20s. It talks about your 20s being the defining decade. That's the title of the book. I don't understand who the audience is supposed to be for this book. I am, I guess, late 20s now, mid to late 20s. Obviously, it's not for me, but I don't even imagine reading it when I'm 20 or when I'm like 18. I don't imagine reading it then and thinking that it was helpful. Like, I don't know who she's trying to target with this book because she's a psychologist and she's talking about different things that she has heard from clients in their 20s who've come to see her, things that people struggle with. But I feel like the people who need to read it won't feel good from reading it. Like, it's not going to encourage them. And the people who would read it and be like encouraged by what she's saying, they don't need to read it. So I'm thinking of, I've got a younger cousin and a younger sister. They are early 20s, well, mid 20s maybe. I don't think they need to read this book. And yet if they were to read it, they'd be like, great, I'm on the right track. Like, she talks about how when you get a job, your 20s will define the rest of your income for the rest of your life, because if you have a certain job and you're getting certain experience, and say you're 21, you're then ahead of anyone who is like 24. And it like makes sense, but I feel like it's not giving what it needs to for the people who actually need it. So for me, I am someone, classic example, like very behind. I've outlined a whole video about this like months ago because I wanted to talk about it and then I just never made it. But like the idea of feeling behind in your 20s, I am a classic example of that. And you would think, okay, maybe this book would be helpful for someone in my situation. Not me, because I think I'm too old for it in terms of the 20s being your defining decade. I'm like well into it now. It's not as relevant for me because I just read it and I'm like, great, I'm behind everyone in every way. What is the point of this book? Like, it just made me feel rubbish. And then I was like, maybe I'll reread it and see if that helps. And I was like, you know what, I'm not putting in more time to reread this book just in the hope that it will give me something or that I can analyze it more meaningfully. I'm just going to go with my reaction to it. I don't get who it's for. It was not helpful. It is perpetuating this like idea that there's a right way to do things, particularly, I guess, if you're a woman, because she does talk about like the biological clock and talk about how like, oh, but women think that they can have children in their late 30s. But, you know, I've seen clients who thought that they would be okay, you know, messing around in their 20s, and then it gets to their late 30s and they actually can't have children. And it's like, okay, I'm sure that does happen, but that's not really helpful. She doesn't seem, as a psychologist, to actually get to the root of why so many people are struggling in their 20s. Like, that for me is the real question. And she seems to say because people are getting married older, or because modern life means the goalposts have moved somehow in terms of your career and in terms of, I mean, this is where I start reading things into it that aren't actually there. But she seems to be saying that because things have changed, that is affecting young people, because we view then our 20s as an extension of our teens in terms of figuring stuff out. Whereas, you know, if you talk to not necessarily your parents, but many people of your parents' generation, they were having children in their mid-20s, so they had more responsibility. But I'm like, I really think that people would still be figuring things out. Like, you're not telling me if you meet your husband or your life partner when you're 21, you're not telling me that when you're both 31 and still together, you're not the same people. Like, you've grown together and you've stayed together, but you're not the same as you were when you're 21. Like, the idea that things are fixed. This book, it wasn't... I don't know who it was for, and I don't agree with the idea that you have to do things in a certain way. Like, I get when she's talking about the data of, like, earning less or opportunities or whatever, that makes sense. But again, for the people the book is for, how is that helpful? I just don't understand. And it's not addressing the fact that one of the things I would think, because this book is recent, right? Like, as I was reading it and she made no mention of climate change, for example, I was like, maybe this book came out in like 2010 or 2000s, like, because for me climate change is a big issue that a lot of people my age, and like, I'm not even Gen Z, I'm on like the cusp of millennial and Gen Z, but like, a lot of people care about this issue. It does have an impact on people's mental health and on the way that they view the world and on how they think about like the idea of legacy or the idea of meaning, the idea of purpose. The fact that the world is becoming more and more uninhabitable, particularly for future generations, that has a huge psychological impact. And when I realized that this book was published recently, I was like, she's talking about the defining decade. She's talking about people who are struggling in their 20s in terms of different mental health issues because she's a psychologist, but she's not even talking about why is it that our culture or our society is making so many people in their 20s feel lost or feel like life is pointless. That to me is the more interesting question. If you hadn't got it already, I really don't recommend you read this book. If you would be heartened by the things that you read in this book, you don't need to read it because you're already doing great. Like, you already maybe have a stable career, or you've got your relationship, or you love traveling, you've saved up loads of money, you have your social circle sorted. If you need this book, you shouldn't read it, which is just like not how a book should be marketed or written at all. So this book was a bit of a mystery to me. I think maybe similarly to the Kate Bowler book, I am coming to it from a specific perspective of someone who really does not have her life together in her 20s, like only recently. Maybe that is making me view this book in a particularly bad light. I really think, no, if you see this book and you think, oh, maybe get this for my, younger sibling or cousin or whatever, no. If they need it, it's not going to encourage them. It's just going to make them feel bad about themselves. And if they don't need it, they're already doing great, so they don't need the book. Like, that's the long and short of it. August was a big reading month for me. I mentioned earlier I was escaping into books because I'd graduated and I felt really uncertain about what was happening and what I was doing. I didn't really post on my YouTube channel that much in August, so I had a lot of time to read and reflect on things and slightly panic about what was happening with my life. The first book I read in August was Winter of the World by Ken Follett. This is the second book of the Century trilogy, so I read the first one, Fall of Giants, earlier in the year. This one is all about World War II, so the first one is about World War One. I'm yet to read the third one. It's on a pile of books that I need to read. I know some people think he can go on. I mean, the book is very long. When you really get into the story and into the web of characters, it's really well done. There were some really poignant bits, particularly because one of the families lives in Nazi Germany. So you can imagine the kind of story that they might have. Although I don't know if you can imagine, because that's one of the things that I quite liked about this book. Because when you think about Nazi Germany, or when you learn about it in school, it's very much about the concentration camps, the Holocaust, as the emphasis should be. This book, he's talking about what it's like to just be someone living in Germany, working in Germany, the oppression that they feel, what everyday life is like, and then it intertwines the horrors of what the Nazis did, intertwines that with this story of this German family. I mean, it's really intense and horrible, but it's also really well done. I then read the last book in the Court of Thorns and Roses series A Court of Silver Flames. I don't think this is the actual last book, but this is like the newest one. It's the last one for now. Well, I don't want to give too much away if you want to read the series, but it's told from a different perspective, like from a different character's perspective from the rest of the books. And that was a bit of an adjustment, but it was also quite refreshing. And I do like how Sarah J. Maas seems to subvert some of the things that you would expect as a reader. It keeps it interesting, specifically as well in Crescent City, which we're going to talk about because that's a book that I read this year. I then read Throne of Glass, also by Sarah J. Maas. This is a different series, the first book of the Throne of Glass series. Of the 3 series, I think I enjoyed Throne of Glass the most. I really enjoyed this book. It's sort of a detective mystery. Horrible things are happening in a castle. There's like a monster on the loose. It's just like a good story in an interesting story world that she's made up and introduces well. Interesting characters. Familiar idea of having like a monster loose in the castle. That's like the second Harry Potter book and so many other stories. But it is really well done. And I read this I'm not sure if I quite read it in a day, but certainly within 24 hours. So maybe like I read some in an evening and then the next day I read the majority of the book. And then it was so good that I read the next book in the series, Crown of Midnight, and the note I made, read in a day, all in capitals. Oh my gosh. I really liked this Throne of Glass series. Then I next read In the Flow by Alyssa Vitti. I made so many notes when I read this book because I was thinking to do a cycle syncing video on my channel. I also read Period Power again by Maisie Hill, which I read last year. If you are someone who has a menstrual cycle, highly recommend you read In the Flow. This talks about how if you have a menstrual cycle, you have an infradian rhythm as opposed to just a circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm is 24 hours, and this is what men operate on hormonally. Like every day is a fresh start, cortisol, blah, 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 profile of hormones. But if you're a woman, you have an infradian rhythm. You have that circadian rhythm of every day, you sleep in the evening, and then you wake up, you sleep. So you've got that 24-hour cycle, but you also have an infradian rhythm, which is a cycle longer than 24 hours. And depending on where you are at in that cycle, your energy level is going to be different, your hormones are going to be different, and that's going to affect the way that you feel, how you feel motivated, if you feel really tired. It's so important to know this, and I wish that I'd been taught this at school. I don't know if the book had come out then, but I wish that this was something that we learned about, because in school, you see that graph of the hormones, you're like, okay, this hormone, but it just feels like science. It didn't feel connected to anything, and it wasn't like, this point in your cycle, it's normal for you to feel irritable, or it's normal for you to feel sad, or it's normal for you to have more energy. That would have been actually useful to be aware of as a young woman. This is information that I could have used earlier. I next read No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. This took me quite a long time to read. I know I finished it in August because that's the books we're talking about now, but I started this in June. It's not that it's difficult to read, it's just that it's a lot to process. I found it easier to just read one chapter at a time and then sit with that for like a week and have that going on in the back of my mind. I loved this book in that from the beginning, it's giving you practical advice. So No Bad Parts, he's talking about how there are different parts operating within us, but none of them are bad. Even if you have a part within you that is harmful, that wants you to hurt other people. He's even talking in extreme cases about physically hurting other people, talking to people who are in prison, for example, for murder. Even if that part wants you to be violent, he's still saying there are no bad parts. Every part of you is trying to protect you. It's a very interesting concept. I guess if you apply it to something like murder, it gets quite controversial because you're like, where does morality factor into that? Or where does free will factor into that? From the first chapter, he's giving you an exercise that you can do as parts work to interact with the parts within you and just say hey, it's different meditations to go into your mind and work out what parts are driving you. Why do you keep self-sabotaging? It could be because there's a part within you that is trying to protect you, and each part was developed at a different age. So if you went through something traumatic when you were 6, you have a part of you that was created when you were 6 to protect you from what you were going through, and that part still thinks that you're 6 and is a protector. So then talking to those parts is reintroducing yourself. It sounds really weird, but I'm just gonna go with it and pretend we're in the paradigm of it and we're all accepting it. Then you're reintroducing yourself to that part, and that part is surprised that you're now in your 20s. Really fascinating, from a psychological perspective, I know some people have really like life-changing stories, you know, they're like, oh, parts work changed my life. I'm not so engaged with it, so it didn't have like a huge impact on me. And I think it's another thing of like, everything is about the same thing in terms of people. Some people will be like, oh, religion changed my life. Some people will be like, oh, parts work, journaling, oh, meditation, yoga, spirituality, whatever. Like, it all feels like parts of the same thing. And I know even that is like controversial to say from a religious point of view, but it feels like we're all looking for meaning or looking to understand things, and there are just so many different routes that you can take, and different people will feel drawn to different things. Like I'm saying, some people are like, oh my gosh, parts work, like it changed my life. And then there's me who's like, yeah, I can see the value of it, but practically for me it didn't make that much difference, or it didn't feel like it fit in the same way as it does for other people, or in the same way that other things really help me. But I really recommend this book. I've still got my copy of it and I'll be returning to it. I read the next book in the Throne of Glass series, Heir of Fire. This was really good, and say again, I recommend you read the Throne of Glass series. Next, I read The Inimitable Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. This originally came out in 1923, 100 years ago. It is so good. If you've not read any Jeeves and Wooster, do yourself a favour. If you've not read any P.G. Wodehouse, do yourself a favour and read some. It's just ridiculous. There are so many points where I literally laugh out loud. Like, you know, when you're reading and something funny happens, you might just go like... It's not going to make you actually laugh out loud. You're like, oh, that's funny. But Jeeves and Wooster, it's so many points where it's just like, oh my God, actually laugh out loud. I have a memory of sitting at school waiting to be picked up, which was a very common occurrence. I was reading Jeeves and Wooster and I kept having to suppress the urge to laugh, because I was like, I'm sat by myself reading this book and I want to burst out laughing. It's going to look really silly. And then I guess that made it more funny, because when you're not allowed to laugh. Really easy to read, really silly premises, ridiculous characters. This is the ideal thing to read if you need a lift. It will just bring you so much joy because it's so ridiculous. I read the next book of the Throne of Glass series, Queen of Shadows. Again, really enjoyed it, all I have to say. And then I started rereading A Court of Thorns and Roses. I was waiting on the next Throne of Glass book from the library and it was just taking forever. So I was like, well, I'll just reread A Court of Thorns and Roses, because I really enjoyed it. And as I said earlier, sometimes I feel like if I read a book really quickly, I'm missing out key details. And it was actually really interesting rereading this book. If you've read it before, you will know like what the twist is. And it was really interesting reading that first book again in the context of reading all of the rest of the series. I encourage you to revisit some books. Like we said with Inkheart, sometimes it can be sad to revisit books. You're like, oh, it's not as good as I thought. But other times you can see something from a different perspective and it's really interesting. Moving into September, I read A Court of Mist and Fury again. I read A Court of Wings and Ruin again. Then I read The Assassin's Blade, which is the next Throne of Glass book. This is like a series of short stories. I don't know if I read it in the right order. I think I should have read it one sooner in terms of the Throne of Glass series, but I still really, really enjoyed it. And I really recommend this series. The next book I read was Anti-Diet by Christy Harrison. I read this book in a day. This is another book that came off of my to-be-read list, and I wish I'd put down who had recommended it to me. It was certainly interesting, but it was also quite discouraging. I don't know if I would recommend this book for that reason. I read Empire of Storms, which is the next book in the Throne of Glass series, and this was incredibly intense. This might be my favorite one of the series. I read it so quickly that there are elements that I think I just didn't pay as much attention to because it was such a page turner, so it will be interesting to reread. And then the next day I started reading and completely finished Tower of Dawn, which is the next book in the series. This book is literally like 600 plus pages long and I read it in a day, which I think tells you more about my mental state than anything else. I was in full flight from reality and was just like, yep, let's just escape into fiction. I read Genesis by Bernard Beckett. This I read as part of my book club and it's not a book I'd heard of before and I probably wouldn't have read it otherwise, but oh my gosh, I highly recommend this if you can find a copy. I actually bought this as a Christmas present for my dad and my uncle because I thought they would really enjoy it. It has such a good ending. I don't want to spoil it, but I think you should definitely read it. It is not that long of a book, so it won't take you very long to read, although I do suggest you take your time with it because it does deal with quite big concepts in terms of AI or just intelligence and what it means to be human in general. So I think you would benefit from reading this a bit slowly and trying to digest it as you go, because it's one of these books you can only read it once. You're going to know the ending once you've read it, and it will be interesting to reread it now that I do know what happens. Yeah, you're never going to be able to read it again for the first time, so I would highly suggest and highly encourage you to take your time reading this, and I really recommend you read it. This is probably in my top 10 books of the year. I loved this book. I reread Jog On by Bella Mackie. I read this in 2020. I got it for my birthday. It was really wholesome and easy to read. I will say though, there were parts of it that irritated me, and I'm not entirely sure why. That's probably, as we discussed earlier, a me thing, something that I'm bringing to the book or something that I'm reacting to. It did its job in that I was then encouraged to start running again. Unfortunately, I've got this problem with my foot, so then I had to stop running again. But I reread A Court of Frost and Starlight, which we've already talked about. I read Thinking on My Feet by Kate Humble. I had no expectations for this book. I bought it on my Kindle because I was like, why not? I was just scrolling through all of the books that were 99p and I was like, what looks interesting to me? And it's all about walking. I loved it so much. I really suggest you buy yourself a copy of this book. It is so beautiful, the way that she describes different scenes, like the scenery as she's walking. It was just a really peaceful, wholesome book, and it was perfect for this time of the year when I was reading it, where I felt really uncertain, still looking for a job. It was nice to retreat to this book, which felt very grounded, really resonated with me because I too find a lot of peace walking outside, calms down the chaos. Highly recommend this book. I bought another book on the 99p sale, which was The Four Agreements, and I wish again that I could remember who recommended this book, because this was one that was on my reading list that I keep. This is a book that I think you should buy because you will want to revisit it. It has so much knowledge or so much wisdom in such a short book. Like, it won't take you very long to read this book. I think it's only 100 pages or so. It feels like this condensed wisdom, and it's so straightforward and so simple. But I think that is where the truth of things often lies. Like, we can often overlook the really simple solutions or the small things, the little things, like I always talk about. We can often overlook those things because we think that they won't make a big difference, but they actually do. So The Four Agreements is about making new agreements with yourself. And one of them that I really resonated with is not to take things personally. These four agreements, the idea is that you apply these in your life and it's going to change the way that you live your life and change the way that you perceive reality and like the way that you approach all of your relationships. And I always take these books with a grain of salt because sometimes, like we talked about with No Bad Parts, they can promise a lot, and sometimes for some people it is the answer. But I was talking with a friend about this recently. For me, none of these books, none of these like personal development or self-help books, these things for me don't have that world changing aspect like they do for some other people. So my friend was giving the example of Atomic Habits, which I've not read, but she said, oh, so many of my friends were talking about this book and how it changed their life. And so she read it and she was like, yeah, it was a good book, but I don't feel that like life-changing aspect. This is to do with recovery stuff. Basically, there is only one solution to my problem, or to as I was talking about with my friend, and I'm not going to find it in like a personal development book. I recommend you read this book. Who knows, it may change your life, but I think it's important to remember that sometimes the answers that we want, it's difficult to say. I seem to be saying two contradictory things, right? I seem to be saying the answers are very simple, but I'm also saying the answer is not simple. But the answer is simple, but I just mean that depending on your worldview, you're going to interpret things very differently. Having said all of that, this book is very interesting and I really recommend it. In October now, I reread Period Power by Maisie Hill. The first time I read this book was last year and it had such a big impact on me. And I don't know if it's because earlier in this year I'd already read In the Flow, which is also about your cycle. A lot of the information, it wasn't repeated, right? Because they're both very different styles of writing, but it's the same topic and I had read the book before. There were just some parts which I didn't resonate with so much. This is a thing of rereading a book, even if it's familiar, it's a new experience every time because you're either a different person, you pick up on different things. And I guess one thing that bothered me when I was reading this book again was that she will say to avoid certain things, so like avoid antibacterial wipes or avoid receipts in terms of things that can cause hormonal imbalances, but she doesn't explain why, or like avoid eating canned foods because the lining of the can is whatever chemicals, BFAs or BPAs or something. And I'm like, okay, if you care about this thing and you think it's important, fine, she's sharing the information. But like, tell me why, or like tell me the actual risk level, because why am I now going around being like, can I eat a can of beans, or can I like pick up a receipt? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not helpful. That has been what has stuck with me from reading the book, which is not the point of the book at all. The point of the book is she's talking about balancing your hormones. So from that point of view, maybe it is important to look at things that, you know, environmental things that can disrupt that balance. But she didn't really go into detail. And I'm just like, I don't get why you would do that, basically. So unfortunately, I didn't enjoy this book quite so much the second time. But having said that, I still do a lot of the things that she's said in terms of cycle syncing and just having an awareness of where I'm at, because it helps you when you know, oh, okay, this is why I'm more emotional today, or this is why I'm craving loads of sugar, this is why I am more tired. Just to have an awareness of that cycle that's going in the background, because it can feel like that's not important. This is a book that I would recommend getting for the younger people in your life. I don't know though, because I don't know if someone had given it to me, maybe I wouldn't care or I wouldn't read it. There will be a point though where I would have been more open to it, and it has definitely changed the way that I plan to do things. So if I know day 21 is a bad day for me, so I'm not going to arrange a really stressful thing or like a big meetup with my friends, I have that awareness, and that helps me manage my mood better throughout the month. This book, while I could wholeheartedly recommend it last year when I read it for the first time, rereading it was a different experience. Another different experience rereading, I reread City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. I read this like 10 years ago probably, or more than 10 years ago. I loved it so much. This time I read it, and I don't know if it's because I was familiar with the story, and there is a film of this book, so I have seen that film, but I just didn't get on with this book. Some of it seemed almost incomprehensible or not plausible or predictable, and I guess predictable would be because I have read it before and I do know the story. I did not sadly enjoy this. I read The Ipcress File by Len Dayton. This book was a book that I originally got from the library from my granny. She tried reading it and it wasn't her thing. And to be honest, when I picked it up, I was like, I don't think she'll like this, but it was sort of a wild card. It's a spy thriller set during the Cold War. I thought, if she doesn't like it, I'll read it, which I did. I enjoyed it. He is the same person who wrote, what's the name of the book? It's a really famous one. I will put it on the screen. Is it SS Britain? The one that was a TV show. I recommend this book. Read it. In November, I read the final book of the Throne of Glass series called Kingdom of Ash. There were parts of this that were interesting and good, as the other books in the series have been. I am kind of in two minds to talk about this because my sister is currently reading the Throne of Glass series and I don't want to put her off reading it. It was really good, but I saw this as well in the Court of Thorns and Roses series. It seems like Sarah J. Maas, the author, she is scared of bad things happening to her characters, and it makes it really irritating after a while to be a reader because there feels like there are no stakes. Everything will be okay in the end. That means that I don't really get invested in big moments. Like in this book, it's the final book, like it should be a huge showdown, but I wasn't really ever worried about any of the characters surviving or anything because I was like, well, of course they will. They have so far through all of this horrible stuff that's happened and they're still alive. Saying that though, I have read the first Crescent City book, and so maybe she's breaking this streak of having like predictable safe outcomes for the characters. This book, the final book, just left me a bit disappointed. I don't know as well if this was because it was politically, what's the word? I'd basically read some stuff about Sarah J. Maas's political views, then it cast the ending of the book in a bad light. At the end of the book, Selena, if you've not read the series yet, Selena says, our children will rule, but the people will have a say. And I'm like, okay, but you're still a hereditary monarchy and not a democracy if you're saying our children will rule. Like, it's stuff like that. I'm like, why am I bringing politics into this book? But at the same time, I'd read this stuff and I was sort of like, it's the question of, can you separate the art from the artist? I mean, I don't know what the answer is, but that certainly influenced the way I read this book. And the other thing I wrote about it, from the beginning of the series, it was such an interesting concept and there were different parts of it that I was really excited to see play out as the series went on, and it felt like those elements were kind of abandoned and other things took over, which is fair enough because when you start writing or when you start any creative project, you don't know how it's going to end. You may have an idea, but that's almost definitely going to change as your ideas evolve. So I'm on the one hand like, fair enough, things changed, but on the other hand I'm like, it feels like I was more interested in the way that it could have gone as opposed to what she actually chose to focus on, which is again a bit disappointing. She never seems to be able to take a character and leave them. Lorcan was bad, but now suddenly he's lovely and part of the crew. Darrow was the antagonist at the start of the book, the noble who is in the way of the crown, and then it turns out at the end he's some soft-hearted old man. No. And I mean, you can see in the fact that I left such a big gap between finishing Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn and then reading the last book. I had a whole month gap. Like, that book was just sat on my shelf and I wasn't reading it. So you could see I wasn't that like enthusiastic about the series anymore. Something had shifted. I read House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This was Crescent City, the first book I mentioned earlier. I loved this in that it was very unexpected what happened, but it also felt like she went too far the other way then. I was like, why have we set up, spoilers, why have we set up this friendship? And you feel like at the beginning, as a reader, you know at the beginning, okay, these characters are being introduced for a reason and I need to care about this and I need to pay attention. And then however many pages in, not that long in, all of that is ripped away and you're like, oh, these people, this set of characters who I thought was going to be so important, they're actually all dead now. And I can get that in terms of shock value. That was a good move. But in terms of me feeling them motivated to read from that point on, I was a bit like, oh, like I kind of wanted to give up. I persevered because my sister was like, it's really good. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to hear what you think about it. But I was a bit like, this feels like a betrayal. It's like the writer and the reader have like an unspoken pact about what is to be expected. And it's great to subvert that. But at the same time, you have to make me as the reader care enough to keep going. If you just like rip away all of the characters and then expect me to keep care, like I've already built up an expectation, I guess, which is probably my fault, but like I have an idea of, oh, this is going to be about their friendship, and it kind of is as the story goes on, but I was not impressed to begin with. I did get into it and I did really enjoy reading this, but again, as I said with the Throne of Glass series, I've got that second Crescent City book. It's been sat, can you see it? Yeah, it's been sat on my shelf there for probably a month or more. I'm not rushing to read the next one. I wasn't so happy with the first book that I'm now like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to read the second one. That could be for many different reasons, but I am partly wondering, is that because I just don't care so much and it wasn't as much of an enjoyable experience as I had hoped it would be. In December, I reread Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. I love this book so much, and that's literally the note that I read. I love this book so much. I really enjoyed rereading this. I don't really know how to talk about it. There is quite a lot of profound truths in this book. I mean, I've talked about a few of the books that I've reread this year and I've not been impressed. This one I reread and I was very impressed still. Like, I still would say I love this book, whereas some of the others that I've been through, I've just been kind of like meh, but not this one. Yeah, I'd say read Flowers for Algernon. And the last book I read was another reread. I need to, maybe that can be my New Year's resolution, to read new books instead of just rereading old books. But the last one I read was Fight Club. I love this book. I also read it at this time last year, or maybe October last year, and it was in my book review because I love it, and it was in my top 10. What did I put? I loved rereading this book. So many standout lines, so raw and powerful. That, I think, is a good summary of it. Please read the book. There's also a film of it with Edward Norton and Brad Pitt and Helena Bonham Carter, which is on Netflix. Came out in 1997, directed by David Fincher. I recently watched it, so that's why all of these facts have stuck in my mind. It is another book that has quite a few profound things to say and says them in a really unique way. Please read it. It's so good. In terms of my top 10, if we go backwards, I would say Fight Club is definitely in my top 10. Flowers for Algernon is in my top 10. Genesis by Bernard Beckett, also in my top 10. Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, another one of my top 10. That's number 4, in no particular order. I'm going to put A Court of Mist and Fury as my number 5. I did like A Court of Wings and Ruin though, but I think A Court of Mist and Fury is my favourite from the Court of Thorns and Roses series. My number 6 is Friends, Lovers and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. 7 is She. Read this book. As I said, it's out of copyright, so if you have a Kindle, go download it for free. Number 8, I'm going to put The Inimitable Jeeves, because I think everyone should read P.G. Wodehouse. You will literally, well, at least I literally laugh out loud when I read these books. 9, I will put as The Four Agreements, because I did enjoy reading that and I read it at an interesting time. And similarly, I will put my number 10 as Thinking on My Feet by Kate Humble, because it was this grounding book with lots of peaceful scenery. I read it at a time where that's exactly what I needed to be reading, because I was facing a lot of uncertainty, having graduated and still looking for a job and working out what I was doing. And I mean, it's funny how things change, because I'm still, like, now I have a job, but I still feel very uncertain about everything. So what's that about? I think this is the thing, right? Everyone is just pretending that they know what they're doing. So if you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm behind everyone, or I don't know what I'm doing and everyone else seems to know, nobody really knows. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but certainly I have no idea. I read significantly less than I did last year because last year I was doing my degree, so I was doing lots of reading for my degree. But I'm pleased with the variety of books that I've read this year, although having gone through them now, I'm realising I did a lot of rereading. And that's good. It's good to reread things that we like, but I think I need to prioritise reading things that I've not read before. What was your favourite book that you read in 2023? Have you read any of the ones that I've listed here and you're like, yes, that was really good, I also read that and I agree? Are you someone who likes Charles Dickens? I said I didn't. Is there anything I've said that you disagree with? Please, as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love more book recommendations. I literally just said that I would like to read more new books this year and books that I've not read before. So please leave your book recommendations in the comments. I will leave one of my book videos on the screen if you want to watch more about books. I love books. I love reading. Happy reading in 2024. Happy New Year. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.